do agroforestry. And so I think I'll do, I'll run through this presentation. I'm just going to touch on things really, really lightly. Not go into any detail on any of it because each one is a known presentation. And then just really try to leave a lot of room for conversation, because this isn't really about me. This is about everyone and all the work that we do. And if I can help provide any detail or highlight any more examples about the things I've experienced or seen or what other people are working on, I'm really happy to head more in that direction and be much more conversational and dialogue about it all. So hopefully that works for you all. I'm going to run through a PowerPoint, which might be kind of boring, but let's see how it goes. Okay, apparently I don't know how to move slides. All right. So yeah, I kind of more or less got my start in Olympia. I actually came to Olympia to go to Evergreen. So hey, Stephen Bramwell, and saw your name on the list there. And spent a couple of years at Evergreen, rocking the farm. And during that time, I actually started a small CSA farm, and we were growing food for the food bank, Thurston County Food Bank. And then ended up establishing a couple of farms in this Olympia region. That kind of led to the development of like the West Olympia Farmers Market, a number of us developing the Thurston Food Systems Council, just doing a ton of incredible work around food and food policy and just good sustainable ag systems. And ended up focusing a lot of my time at Delphinia Community Farm. That's really where I got my really early start in agroforestry. Was super into permaculture, doing a lot of high diversity, kind of crazy, small scale, all handwork kind of stuff. I was too poor to have a tractor. Was fighting off the elk that you might be able to see in the background of one of these pictures. Just, going crazy at it with the diversity. And that led me the opportunity to work for the South Sound Small Farms program with Lucas Paxic and a whole number of awesome people at Mason Conservation District. My position was actually split between 50-50 between Mason CD and Thurston County. And I was working a lot with Thurston CD as well on a number of different projects. And that was a really phenomenal position to have, not just personally, but I think it's something I talk about everywhere I go. I just think that collaboration was absolutely phenomenal. The ability to utilize the WSU Extension network and resources and do broad scale education and outreach opportunities and get involved in some research. Like some of these pictures here are at Colville Ranch down outside of Tumwater, looking at grazing warm season grasses and prairie species in the endemic prairies down there. Stuff that's super relevant for silvopasture development in savanna landscapes or prairie landscapes. But then at the same time, actually being able to go one-on-one with landowners and provide funding for BMPs or provide opportunities to plant silvopasture. So we were actually developing silvopasture systems in Mason County and doing a lot with riparian buffers, doing a lot with water quality, soil health. So it's just an absolutely well-rounded, phenomenal position that I can't urge more collaboration between organizations like that enough. I just think the resource efficiency and the crossover between their programmatic reaches are just absolutely phenomenal to have that direct link in there. So I think that's something that I hope is continuing. If it's not, it continues to head in that direction. As Carrie mentioned, kind of the last bit of time when I was at WSU, Cindy Dipbrenner, Paul Cherigino, Carrie, and I worked on this working buffer study where we developed a document that basically looked at alternative multifunctional riparian management systems, kind of looking at the agroforestry USDA definition agroforestry framework and how they can apply to riparian corridors. And that was, I think that's so important to keep bringing back to the table. It takes a lot of policy changes and a lot of cultural changes to make that shift, and it's certainly happening. And I'll talk about it in a second, but I really brought that work to Pennsylvania and we kind of ran with it, and I'll give some examples about what happened there. So from there, like Carrie mentioned, I ran off to PA, somewhat unintentionally, but went for it. I actually got a position with the USDA. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. The USDA Ag Research Service. which is the kind of research arm of the USDA that defines policy and it defines NRCS related work and BMP implementation, water quality, all the fun stuff. I work for the Pasture System and Watershed Management Research Unit. So we were really interested in water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. So I was part of a kind of an extended study on assessing the CREP program in the Chesapeake Bay at its 15th year and looking at efficacy of conventional riparian buffer systems, and recognizing and using some really interesting GIS technologies and some field assessments to really understand how these systems are maybe need to evolve beyond the conventional approach, kind of standard setback ideas, standard width approaches to riparian buffers, or even just species development and the static state buffers, as we call them, the lack of actual management in the buffers, and trying to really help define at the top of the chain at the USDA that there should be a shift in policy to allow for alternative use and alternative design in riparian buffer management and water quality in general, particularly for phosphorus and nitrogen. That was the big resource concern in Chesapeake Bay area, which is definitely different than what the big resource concern is in the Pacific Northwest, but I think it's also extremely relevant. And that led to a statewide program that a number of us developed with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resource, which they called the Multifunctional Buffer Program. There was $3 million invested in 3 years to help reach a goal. I don't remember what the metric was, but it was something like a couple 100,000 acres of forested riparian buffers in 3 years. And one of the barriers to adoption was getting landowner interest. So we formulated this, we kind of took that working buffer study idea that the folks at Snohomish and NOAA and myself worked on and kind of expanded it into alternative buffer design systems for Pennsylvania, or really the Chesapeake Bay region, but focusing in Pennsylvania. And it was funded for $3 million for 3 years to implement a number of different, focused primarily on multifunctional systems. So looking at native, high value native croppable tree species, and actual management of those species. So the ability to go in and do some coppice work or some thinning, harvest work, even some machine harvest work when applicable as those systems come online. So that was really exciting to be able to just jump right in and really start altering policy and provide opportunities for landowners to get engaged. And that program, I don't think is funded currently, but it had a pretty tremendous amount of success. So I'm pretty sure it's going to continue. I've been kind of out of the loop for the last couple of years on that. Another thing we did, which I think is really relevant to your group, is right when I moved to town, I got really plugged in with some folks like Kate McFarland from the National Agroforestry Center, Tracy Coulter from Pennsylvania DCNR, Erik Burkhart, just a ton of people in the Northeast. And we wrote a Northeast SARE Professional Development Program grant to provide a number of professional development trainings throughout the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. So basically Virginia all the way up to New England. But really focusing on professional development. So really targeting, institutional TSPs, technical service providers, looking to train up folks that have impact on policy or have kind of direct ability to translate the work in the field in broad scale efforts. So working a lot with NRCS folks, DNR folks, extension, conservation districts, and having just a ton of training opportunities. We did 2 3-day trainings one in Pennsylvania, one in upstate New York. We did a full multi-year monthly webinar series, a bunch of in the field training days, just like single days. And we did a bunch of, I think we did 3 2-day designing agroforestry system trainings, which were just extremely relevant. I think that was one of the things in your survey that came up. And I think that is a real critical barrier between good adoption or really good advanced understanding of how agroforestry is applied in different contexts, not just kind of the standard ideology of what is agroforestry, but really going beyond and representing that agroforestry is not just those 5 defined practices with the defined by the USDA, but really a whole suite of management systems. So it really just opens up the conversation quite a bit, and it really starts to really target good natural resource management in so many different ways without getting stuck in kind of the rhetoric of agroforestry. So I definitely, I loved hearing that in the survey. I think those sorts of trainings and those sorts of networking opportunities are critical. The other big outcome that came out of this was the establishment of what we called NEMA, the Northeast Mid-Atlantic Agroforestry Working Group. Very similar to what you guys are developing, what you're doing. It was just a number of us, a coalition of folks from all over the region, kind of trying to represent someone from every state and as many kind of organizations as we could, and just have a roundtable to talk and to share resources and to make sure, you know, to do trainings or get grant funding. A lot of that is continuing, but not the same intensity, unfortunately, since the Northeast SARE. That's the same thing that happened in the Midwest. And it's definitely been a big concern for a lot of these agroforestry working groups that they kind of fizzle out when the funding's not there. But I think what's really cool about what you guys are doing is, as far as I know, you don't have any major funding source like this yet. And you know, that is just, to me, that's it, right? That's grassroots. That means you are now in the position to have exactly the data and the background and the resources and the networks to apply for a fairly massive grant to really move a lot of this forward and get into the circles faster than we did. We kind of did a top-down approach where we had the resource and we had the programming, and we just started hitting it really hard, and it worked really well. But you know, in some ways the network fizzled out. So cross state lines, it gets really hard without money, but the work actually happened. So that's what's really, really, I think, extremely important. Another thing that was kind of an outcome of that was there was a lot of interest in agroforestry in terms of actual value of agroforestry and like industry development and commercialization. So a number of us wrote a grant to explore chestnut aggregation and processing. That was one of the big things that kind of came out of all of our trainings, was how chestnut was probably the #1 tree crop opportunity for the Northeast and arguably everywhere in the US except the Southwest. And even then it's kind of possible. I think Pacific Northwest is a tremendous opportunity. One of the biggest chestnut farms in the US is actually in the Skagit. But we went around to a number of different chestnut co-ops and really tried to understand, like, what are the different ways to do it? One, we went to Michigan State, which is publicly funded. It's actually managed by the Michigan State University Extension. And then we went to Route 9 Chestnut Co-op, which is all farmer-led, farmer-owned, very DIY from the ground up. So really kind of assessing 2 different chestnut co-ops and what are the economics, what are the barriers, what are the pros and cons between the different methods. And then we started to develop a chestnut co-op of our own. We built a mobile processing unit, which is the picture that you see here. And we started using this to go around to different plantings, primarily with the American Chestnut Foundation plantings, but a few others that were in the area already, and starting to build a market. So through my farm that I was developing, I planted a bunch of chestnuts there, but I had a retail. We had a restaurant on this site. We had retail outlets. I had a number of wholesale accounts. So it was really moving a lot of chestnut product through that. But then I left. But there's, like, the Northeast is just filled with pretty amazing people. And right away there was 3 other co-ops that started. The Keystone Nut Co-op, focusing a lot on hickories and oaks, as well as chestnuts, but also doing a lot with persimmons and pawpaws. Silviculture is another group that formed in Maryland that focuses largely on chestnuts, but also do a lot with other nuts and a lot of education and some research. Then there's a New York group called NITCA, New York Tree Crop Alliance or something like that. And they're just doing super amazing stuff. A lot of breeding work up there too, which is extremely important for a lot of this to work. So yeah, like Carrie said, while I was doing all of this, I was also developing this 60-acre farm, windswept agroforestry farm right outside of State College, so right outside of Penn State. So I was able to like basically ride my bike to class, come home and build greenhouses and plant trees and do all this. It was kind of nuts. I don't know how I'm not burnt out. So maybe I was burnt out. Maybe that's why I decided to leave. I don't know. I wouldn't recommend doing all that. So yeah, I then in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, I moved to the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. Got the last Penske truck that was available before shutdown. Came out here, never been out here before, woke up on this farm and just totally fell in love. I live in the driftless region of Wisconsin, so this is the unglaciated region. So it is very hilly, very topologically diverse. And I now live right on the Wisconsin River, and it's just, this is where Aldo Leopold's from. This is where Rachel Carson got all her inspiration. This is kind of the hub of the conservation ethic of the United States, and it is embedded in this culture. There's a lot of tribal influence in a lot of the community here too, which is super exciting, which is also largely why the Savanna Institute was kind of born out of this region. We are in the part of the US that is Savanna prairie landscape. So the Savanna Institute is hubbed based out of Champaign, Illinois, where the University of Illinois is, which is basically flatland corn desert at this point, but it was pretty much pure prairie. And then we also have our main office hub outside of Madison, Wisconsin, in the driftless region, which is a very dynamic savanna ecosystem. Your typical oak savanna looks very much like the Spain de Hazes that folks might hear about. And so the idea of the Savanna Institute kind of trying to bring back the perenniality of the Midwest. We are a very corn or commodity grain and CAFO dominant environment here. We are the corn basket of the US. And really recognizing a need for diversity for all the obvious reasons I'm not going to get into, but so our organization was launched 10 years ago. Our mission is to catalyze the development and adoption of scalable agroforestry. We do this through the development of tree crops, so actually assessing, evaluating, and breeding different characteristics of tree crops to be economically viable for the displacement of corn and soy, or the incorporation into those systems at scale. Farming systems research is a big component of what we do. So we look at how do you do alley cropping? You know, there's a lot of like, oh, it's easy. It's really not. It's actually quite complex, and it's an evolving system. So how does it really work mechanically, but also how does it work economically? And then really assessing the environmental impacts on all of that. So we have a whole ecosystem. I'll talk a little bit about our research component stuff, but we do a lot of research on not just the economic, but a lot of the ecological research of what we're actually doing. And then really focusing on stakeholder development. We're not here to do this ourselves. We're really here to just kind of catalyze it, kickstart the information, find the barriers to adoption and alleviate those barriers so that farmers, TSPs, landowners can make it actually happen. So we're really just community development with a lot of research focus. Like I said, we are pretty serious about making something really happen. Our goal is literally to displace 1 million acres of corn and soy. That's not just incorporating into corn and soy. So we're not counting just tree row acreage. We're not counting just acreage that trees are on with corn and soy. We are trying to displace 1 million acres of corn ground with tree cropping systems. We do that through demonstration, farmer training and adoption, and research, like I mentioned. We have a whole bunch of different programs to how we do this. We have an education program, and I'll run through each of these. Technical support, research, tree crop commercialization, and a demonstration farm network, which I'm part of. So education and outreach, we really focus on, getting partner farms and those actually doing it to really represent what they do, what they've discovered and how they do it. So we have a ton of field days. That's kind of our bread and butter. We also have an annual conference, the Perennial Farm Gathering, which has been online the last few years, so anybody can really join. It's just a fantastic network of folks, researchers, but primarily farmers actually describing what they do and why and how it's working for them. It's just a fantastic place to meet a ton of people and get really focused on agroforestry systems. And we put out a lot of publication material, and we're really hoping to really bolster that. That's one of our things that we found. Not everyone can come to the Midwest to really see what we're doing, and it's really applicable to the Midwest contextually. But I think what we're focusing on over the next couple of years is really turning that into good publications that other people worldwide or even just nationally can really get their hands on and help to understand, and then we can really help be part of reaching out beyond just the Midwest. And this is kind of where our technical support program, this one I'm going to talk a lot about because I think it's extremely relevant for how I think good agroforestry adoption could happen in regions. So we launched a technical service program. When I came in, I wrote a grant for a NRCS cooperative agreement. So effectively, NRCS provides funds to kind of enhance their TSP, their own field staff, with partnerships through other organizations that have natural resource concern focus. So there's usually a lot like Trout Unlimited or Pheasants Forever, or some other kind of natural resource focused nonprofit. We are extremely lucky that we have some really incredible NRCS state leads that have really pushed for agroforestry being allowed and adopted and focused priority funding for in Wisconsin. So we kind of came in at the right space at the right time, and they were extremely generous and have actually given us 2 rounds of funding to develop this technical service program. So we can actually act as NRCS field staff, go out and develop contracts, do design work, get implementation dollars, and really walk landowners through the whole step of BMP or implementing these practices specifically for alley cropping. Alley cropping and silvopasture are the 2 big focal points here. Riparian buffers are not culturally, we are a grassland-based environment, so riparian buffers are not necessarily like ecologically relevant here in a lot of ways. So we're kind of working on different strategies for water quality that might be not as applicable to your region, but very interesting nonetheless. Yeah, and of course, windbreaks and hedgerows and all those other things are super relevant. We were also able to get a pretty substantial funding through the EPA, the Gulf of Mexico program for water quality. So we are doing a lot of environmental monitoring on alley cropping and silvopasture on nitrogen leaching, because that is the natural resource concern for the Gulf of Mexico primarily. So that's been a huge plus. That actually gave us 2 more TSPs and actually helped us launch a position called the Community Agroforester. So now basically what we've done is we've created kind of a whole client intake workbook, so to speak, where clients come to Savanna Institute expressing interest, and they work directly with the community agroforester, who is kind of the liaison between kind of direct implementation funding and the rest of the resources that SI has, so they can really help to kind of one-on-one educate landowners that might be in different places and understanding what their issues might be or what their interests might be, and then help to kind of connect them to who would be the best person to work with. I think that is a pretty phenomenal staff position that I think a lot of institutions should really think about carrying, just having a good liaison to direct people to the who, where, and what, and why. And then we also have gotten a lot of funding through the Great Lakes Protection Fund, which focus on the Great Lakes watershed, but that is allowing us to come out with a lot of really good research and publication material on water quality management with agroforestry systems. So that'll be coming online probably in the next year or 2. We'll have a lot of research, a lot of publications focused on water quality efforts with agroforestry system, with a lot of research to back it up. So that's really exciting. This year alone, we worked directly with 43 farmers, and there's only, I think there's there's one TSP in Wisconsin, one in Iowa, and one in Illinois. And we've already established 2,600 acres of agroforestry across those 3 states. So, and it's just going to snowball. That's just year one. So I really think, and I can't emphasize enough, one of the biggest barriers that I've found to adoption of agroforestry really is about consulting, design, and technical support. We need to go beyond the rhetoric. We need to go beyond the definitions. We need to get away from set standard practices and just get good consultants and designers and TSPs out there that are educated on natural resource issues, get that funding that is out there and available, and convince the state leads for NRCS and other EPA and Department of Ecology and different institutionals that hold those funding standards, and really try to get some flexibility. And I think like all the network that you're building is really that opportunity to do that. So that's super exciting. Like I said, we do a ton of research. We are focusing a lot on tree crop improvement. So we do have a number of really interesting breeding programs going on. We just put in our first 15-acre breeding for hybrid hazelnuts, and 10 acres of chestnuts to start a breeding program, which a lot is going to come out on that using drone technology and all kinds of crazy genotyping, and a lot of genetic work of genotyping and understanding physical traits or genetic traits of different crops, so we can use that to rapidly advance tree crop breeding, specifically for some of these crops that have not had that at all, like chestnut, persimmon, currant, and elderberry. Hazelnut has a lot in Oregon primarily and in Europe, but not the hybrid hazels that is really relevant for colder climates. We're doing a lot of field-based research, so a lot of water quality and soil health, looking at carbon sequestration, nutrient runoff, phosphorus management, all those fun things. And we're doing some really cool GIS assessments of like tree suitability, to be able to use that for data to describe the potential impact that agroforestry systems might have. So basically looking at the physical context of the landscape of either a region or a watershed or a state. Really, we're doing this for the entire Midwest so that we can kind of zoom in on even a parcel and understand what, given the soils, the climates, the water, the natural resource issues, whatever the context might be, what tree crops might be suitable for that area, and what might be suitable given climate change and genetic improvements. So if we get persimmons to be hardy to zone 4B, what does that do for the potential for persimmon production across the Midwest? What that impact economically? What might that mean for conversion of corn ground to persimmon production, and vice versa? So that is also going to be released as a kind of a web form, so folks can actually look at their individual properties or a watershed and really get some good data out of that. And a lot of focus right now is on commercialization. So not just like getting the crops to produce or even how to grow them, but also how to sell them. What are the barriers to supply chain and market development? What are the economic impacts for rural communities with these different crops? How do these compare to corn acreage? What is an acreage of corn on, say, 200 bushel acre corn on this ground? What would it be compared to 2 tons of chestnuts on this ground economically, and what that might mean across a whole region? And then really use that to kind of help catalyze and participate in hub development, like aggregation and processing, really studying and assessing what are those barriers to making that industry work, and seeing how we can either leverage resources or actually be the ones to do it, to initiate it before converting it to a farmer-led system. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that we're dialoguing in that realm. And with this specifically, going back to the research thing, we're looking at a lot of technology improvements. So one of the big barriers to tree cropping systems, so not just kind of diversified natural resource management agroforestry like a windbreak or or riparian buffers, but kind of like an orchard or alley cropping type agroforestry system, is really in the efficiency. So if you look at every other industry, orchard industry, there's technologies for good cultivation strategies or weed management or pest management, but also really around harvesting. A lot of these crops do not have markets, or their markets are kind of domestic commodity markets that are driven by global demand. Even though we might be the largest producer of them, we are our largest consumer of them. We're not the producer of them. So we're already kind of stuck within a framework of a global commodity, meaning price per acre or price per pound is marginal, and it's harder to now mark that up. So instead, we really got to focus on efficiencies in the field. So that's machine harvestability. So a lot of our breeding is one for systems for machine harvestability, but also looking at developing new low cost, small scale machine harvesting technology to actually be able to bring some of these to market at economically viable values. That doesn't mean things can't be on much smaller scale and hand harvested. But again, a lot of our tree crop focus is on these larger scale systems because of our goal is large scale displacement. We're really looking at larger systems with the Savanna Institute. I mentioned this earlier, we have a demonstration farm network throughout the region. So we work with like county parks or larger institutional organizations that might have a 20 acres or 50-acre farm that want to do a project on, or even farm partners that are already doing projects, and basically implement agroforestry systems for that given area. So we are in the Midwest, so we go everywhere from zone 3 all the way down to zone 6. Everything from hilly driftless savannas to flat corn, nothing but corn for 100 miles. And so we're really trying to expand our reach with real good tangible demonstration sites that are very well managed, and that really target those crops that could be very viable in those communities. That way we have areas that we can bring people to without having to expect people to drive 5 hours to come up to Spring Green when you're in Southern Illinois. But these kind of decentralized networks of groups of communities and groups and SI engagement in these demonstration sites. I just think that's an incredibly important way to really get high advanced adoption from folks. And this leads me to my work. How much time do I have? It's 4:50. This ends at, sorry, it would be 2:50 for you guys. Should I try to wrap up in like 15 minutes?
I think that'd be fine. You think so, Karen?
I'll take that as a yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, about 10 minutes, and then yeah, that would be perfect.
And we
Thanks.
can have a discussion.
Yeah, good. Yeah, sorry, I'm off to the races on this one. So one thing that we had a major challenge with our demonstration farm network is actual long-term ownership and management of sites in order to do our breeding, specifically our breeding, but also our environmental and ecological research work. The Midwest is very weird, where there's statutes of limitations in the state constitutions that no long-term agricultural lease can go beyond 15 years. Basically, it was designed for annual cropping systems to be able to get out of long-term leases and kind of stay up with the per acreage lease rates that change with the commodity market. Agroforestry doesn't work that way. We're not really going to pay off some of these cropping systems until just around 15 years. So we really needed to be able to get some long-term access to good large-scale crop ground to be able to deploy a number of different sites, but also our tree crop breeding program. So we established a Spring Green campus in Spring Green, Wisconsin. We actually have, sorry, I thought I had another slide there. We actually have 4 farms set right alongside the Wisconsin River, which flows directly into the Mississippi River, just not even 100 miles down the road. And It's comprised of just under 800 acres. 400 acres is cropland. The remaining is in savanna, prairie, woodlot. Some, we have timber programs and things like that we're working on as well. And we're really focusing on the cropland conversion of agroforestry systems. We're basically going into our second year. Last year, we planted about 25 acres of hazelnuts and 10 acres of chestnuts, and converted, I think 80 acres of crop ground to pasture in order for us to start doing some silvopasture by addition. And then fenced in a bunch of ground to start doing silvopasture by subtraction. So managing the oak savannas with grazing that had some invasive weed management concerns. The hazelnuts are super interesting. We did 2 different systems, one of which 15 acres of the hazelnuts is particularly a breeding project. It's a best by best cross. So there's seedlings that we're going to evaluate for potential new cultivar development. So that's like 1,500 shrubs on that property. And that would be this image here. So this is one of our farms is very flat bottomland of the Wisconsin River. So it's very homogeneous soils. So these are all best by best F1 crosses of hybrid hazelnuts that were kind of the leading evolution of Mark Shepard, who I'm sure a lot have heard of, but also Phil Rutter from Badger Set, and Carl Weschke. These are folks that have kind of many years ago, 40, 50 years, have been working on developing hybrid hazels for this particular region. This is kind of the last iteration of those. And then on the North Farm, where I live, this is the North Farm here, we did a 7-acre commercial pilot where, so a lot of the hazelnuts in the Northeast and the Midwest have strictly been with seedlings. Seedlings are not machine harvestable because none of them come ripe at the same time. Every shrub is different. So the only way to make this an economically viable crop is to actually look at clonal propagation, the same thing with apples and peaches and plums and everything else. So this is the first clonal hybrid hazelnut farm in the US. We only had 7 acres of genetic material to work with because clonal propagation of hybrid hazels is extremely difficult. It's another thing that we're researching how to get over. And we did some alley cropping in this to do kind of an economic assessment of what does establishment look like for an alley cropping system of hazelnuts. So the hazelnuts were planted at 25-foot centers, and we did vegetables for the first year. We did carrots, beets, and potatoes at scale, and kind of on a bed system. So basically 4 beds between 2 rows of hazelnuts. These are the potatoes, these are the carrots. We did a lot of cover cropping research because now we're starting to shift into, we're going to plant some kernza, we're going to do some prairie, do some grazed prairie management. So warm season grasses and cool season native grasses for grazing, then compare it to cool season non-native grasses for grazing. We're going to integrate some elderberries and black currants in between these rows. We're doing a lot so we're doing all of this organically, which is also really exciting. This was a conventional grain farm, so we're dealing with all the fun issues of that. And so we're trialing a number of different methods of organic establishment. So this is like a wood chip establishment. This is basically a chop and drop system. So we have alfalfa in the alleys. And we're using a forage chopper to flail mow and blow in that material directly on the rows for weed suppression, but also nutrient management. In establishment near, don't use alfalfa. It's way too hot in nitrogen. We learned that, so we're shifting into no-till drilling in like sorghum sudan and rye and oats, and to kind of help add more carbon so we don't get that issue. We're also doing some kind of novel cultivating equipment, specifically the one on your left, which is kind of a side cultivator system that's worked really well for us. And like I said, a lot with chestnuts. The chestnuts are really, this is a cold hardiness project. This property is in zone 4B. So we got -25 last week. That is kind of an average low annually. We do actually get down to -50 in some years. I think the record here is -53 for, I think, 3 days. So the genetics in this are, we called every chestnut breeder in the US and asked them to send us what they think is their most cold hardiness trees. So there's 75 different mother trees. These are all seedlings. So we know the mother, but we don't know the parent or the father, the fraternal pollen. But so these are basically hybrid chestnuts, American, European, Japanese, Chinese, trying to really focus on the American, Japanese, and Chinese genetics for cold hardiness and production. And they're planted at double density in a silvopasture. So I will be grazing this coming year. These fields got fenced, and so we'll be running sheep and cattle through these fields here, and playing with some novel livestock fencing systems. So these are planter tree tubes, so fiberglass rod and a plastic tube. And so we'll be doing some different electrifying the tree tubes, or running basically a poly wire at the, kind of at knee height to keep cattle confined within the alleys. We're wrapping each tree tube in hot poly wire so cattle can actually graze in between the alleys. So there's a lot of cool research we're going to be doing on how do you actually do silvopasture. It's extremely difficult at establishment. And so we're working with Plantra and Premier One supplies to kind of come up with a number of different systems that'll work for that. This is just another one of our chestnut plantings. There's some oak savanna here, the Wisconsin River out over there. This is actually all a sand dune of the Wisconsin River. So again, really looking at context specificity about these crops. So chestnuts love and prefer high acid, well-drained soil, sandy soils, which is, even though this is a bit too cold for chestnuts in their native range, it is the absolute most ideal soils in the Midwest for chestnut development. So we are focusing a lot on chestnuts. We're doing large scale nursery. So this is a half-acre chestnut. We grew out like 15,000 chestnut seedlings for distribution to the Midwest. Again, these are all the 75 different selections or mother trees that we were able to obtain. We also did a lot of persimmons and hickories, pecans, all sorts of cool stuff. And lastly, we're kind of really getting into the use of livestock as a management strategy. So a lot of the Midwest in the savannas are still managed by prescribed burns, which is an absolute fantastic strategy, but there's still a lot of landowners grazing woods and grazing kind of marginal lands with kind of degrading effects. So we're doing a lot of research on how to do better grazing strategy for woodland or savanna restoration, particularly for warm season grass prairie as an understory. So working with NRCS and the Nature Conservancy and a bunch of different partners on, this is actually on one of our other farms here where we got 50 cow-calf pairs we're grazing in, kind of a central hardwood oak savanna, kind of an establishing prairie. But basically looking at the use of different tools, whether is it best to just burn it? Is it best to just graze it? Or is it best to do a prescription of both grazing and burning, depending on the context? And what is that context? When is the best use of cattle or a combined practice? So yeah, just a ton of cool stuff. I can just keep rambling all day long, but I think I'd really like to hear from you guys in terms of what are you interested in? What can, is there anything else I can provide context on that might be useful? Oh, and I also just want to quickly say, like, we view all of this as a continuum, right? Like I said, we are really focusing on displacing corn and soy and kind of alley crop systems and looking at commercial markets for a lot of these crops, but really our main goal is really looking at things as a continuum. That's just iteration one, right? Let's just get people doing this. And then think about what are the new ecological adjustments that need to be made with these systems, and where do these systems convert to over time? And that's why we do a lot of prioritization on the ecosystem service assessments, and we're really focusing on those native warm season grasses and native prairie environments, and just different habitat qualities and values, and really trying to understand where do these systems go. There's going to be trade-offs with doing agroforestry. This is definitely not a perfect system. But we do really need, I think it's really important to always focus on the fact that, I always joke and say, like, in 20 years from now, someone else is going to have my job and wonder what the heck was I thinking? Because it's always that way, right? Like, 20 years ago, we were barely talking about organic farming. And now it's like, it's gone from organic to permaculture to resilient to integrative to regenerative to like everything. It's just this constant advancement. So to me, that's the most exciting thing about agroforestry, is it's like a forced advancement and catalyzes that advancement. And now we got to figure out what to do with it next.
Well,
So that's all I have. I'll stop rambling.
thank you, Eric. That I'm always just blown away by all the different things the Savanna Institute works on. It's amazing what you guys do in your region. And yeah, I will say we are at time. So we are at the hour. But we do have this reserved for an extra half hour for questions and collaboration and that kind of thing. So if you can stick around with us, feel free. And if you have to move on, that's fine as well. But yeah, any questions for Eric? I do see a few in the chat. One question is, can folks visit the Spring Green Farm if they are in the Wisconsin area?
Yes, absolutely. Really anytime. I mean, we do have our set schedule of events that are really great times to do that, but I live here. So, I try not to tell everybody. We're not public, so you can't just show up, but I really do like to invite everybody out. And if you just reach out directly to me, I'm always happy to show you around, show you what we're doing. We're going to have a really robust apprenticeship program this year. So I think that's also a really great opportunity for them to get in the mode of teaching and talking about agroforestry and what they're working on. So, but yes, 100%, anytime, just let me know.
And too, if you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask directly, or you can type anything into the chat as well. And I'll keep an eye on that.
Hey, Eric, this is Bruce Reed from Edwards Mother Earth Foundation. I had a quick question. You talked about like agroforestry being a kind of a suite of management systems versus just like the 5 types that get identified by the USDA. Can you elaborate on that more? I mean, do you kind of see that for the TSPs and the people working on design? Is that something that needs to be more of a focus?
Personally, I do think so. I think there's a really, really important justification for why they bucketed things into 5 practices. One, so it's easily understood and it's easily defined and it's easier to set standards. One of the biggest issues we've had in deployment of agroforestry as a BMP, as a kind of a natural resource concern implementation strategy, is the ability to monitor and standardize the outcomes. We don't have enough TSPs on the ground to represent what kind of a modified standard to a riparian buffer, what was the outcome justified to the public investment. And so that makes a lot of sense, and that's why it's there. But I think it's really time to evolve beyond that. I think there's too many ideas. There's enough research and enough good peer-reviewed scientific research that actually majority of it came out of the USDA, the lab I worked for and the lab down in Tifton, Georgia, that really represents that those standard strategies are actually the real barrier to the outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve. That in some cases we can be doing more harm than good by limiting a system to the standards that they were initially proposed. This is really important for like phosphorus management and nitrogen management, where these systems can actually become a source of those issues if they are not managed for the outcomes that they were demonstrated to be. And this is why I think it's really important to understand that these systems are entirely, no tree is going to grow the same on the same soil type, let alone the same drainage system, let alone the same climate. So to have a standard practice with standard width requirements and kind of the rhetoric behind it all it really limits not just the creativity, but it really limits the ability for these systems to transfer across different regions, and really limits them to be really well designed specific to the context that they're in, so that they actually can be successful. There are so many 15-year-old crep riparian systems that I've seen that are, we jokingly call them tree tube farms, because nothing ever came out of them, because there was just the same 5 or 7 tree species that were planted the same way, managed the same way, and they all died because of different reasons. And no one really went into understanding what those different reasons were and changed the policy. So all that to say is, when I talk about like getting away from the 5 practices, is I think it's really important that they're there. And I think it's important to teach them from the beginning, but they should not be prescriptions. Not every farm should be looked at as, where do we put the buffer? The riparian forest buffer. Well, come to the Midwest, you plant a riparian forest buffer, and you will cause more phosphorus loading, more erosion, more stream degradation, and deplete trout habitat if you plant trees in that environment at that density that a riparian forest buffer would allow. So now we need to think about buffer, an active system that is meant to mitigate a water quality concern and provide habitat, maybe being somewhere else targeted in the landscape that would actually do that function without the degrading effect. And that is required of doing that is getting away from a bucket, getting away from just a riparian forested buffer or alley cropping or forest farming. Does that help? Does that help answer your question? And I think the only real way to do that is to train more TSPs. Like, again, to me, that is probably besides all the tree crop development stuff, and that's really just looking at like orchard, like cropping systems. If we want good habitat, even if we want good natural resource management, I really think the barrier there is TSPs and getting trust within the institutions and the funders that TSPs are equipped enough to make good decisions, and then carry that funding over into good monitoring system. Like making sure that those TSPs are trained to go back out and monitor. And this is where a lot of like carbon credit trading programs, phosphorus credit trading programs, this is where a lot of those kind of programs really come in, where now you can pay farmers not on the per acre that they implemented a system, but instead on the actual service that they did, which then gets them in the mindset that it's not just the Band-Aid on the side of the field doing the job, but it's actually how I manage everything in the field. And really the only way to do that very well is getting good consultants and TSPs and monitoring systems on the ground. And allowing farmers to be creative. Forgot that one. That's just probably the other most important thing. Allowing farmers to be creative and work with those TSPs.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, Eric, too, talking about the standards and how they are important, but how there is value in being more flexible and having some more creativity, because I think cultural context, I think you can really limit certain cultural interactions with these systems or different understandings from different types of folks if you are trying to adhere everyone and fit everyone and their landscape into a very specific standard. So that's, yeah. Someone did ask, what does TSP stand for? Technical Service Provider.
It's worth mentioning that the TSP is also, and I think this is what maybe you're referring to, Eric. I mean, that's a term for a person that has a relationship with the NRCS and can provide technical services through some of their programs like EQIP, correct?
Yeah, and that's kind of a standard. That's what they call their certified people to actually be able to work a client through their program. Yeah. But TSPs can also be applied to anybody, an extension, right, a private consultant, anybody that's providing consultation.
If I can ask on that, because you mentioned it a couple different times, just how important it is to build out the network and capacity of TSPs. I feel like something we deal with in this region, and I've heard in other regions too, this kind of chicken egg problem of being able to train TSPs and being able to also engage landowners and get them interested in agroforestry, but having the difficulty of not really having much on the ground to show people and do that training, and that it becomes that chicken egg situation. I'm just curious, how did you guys sort of prime the pump, so to speak, in the Midwest to generate all this momentum and train these TSPs and get that, kickstart that whole process? Was it that NRCS cooperative grant that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the Midwest is very different. So I could speak to the Midwest and the Northeast very differently. In the Midwest, so we really got started out of the University of Illinois by Ron Revord and Kevin Waltz. They were both grad students under Sarah Taylor Lovell, who had a real interest in landscape design. She's a tenured faculty, was a tenured faculty at University of Illinois. Her background was landscape architecture and multifunctional systems. So she got a very large grant to actually, at University of Illinois, in the middle of their corn research station, plant a polyculture system. So looking at in-row polycultures and between-row polycultures and just kind of that multi-story perennial tree crop system, polycultural system. That really led to a number of grad students coming in and really pushing that conversation and holding a lot of events. And there was arguably still very low landowner interest. But in Illinois, the majority of farmland in the Midwest is not owned by the farmer or the operator. It's owned by absentee landowners that lease it out. So it's the landowners in Chicago or the landowners in California or landowners elsewhere that are hearing about regenerative ag or permaculture, polyculture systems, or wherever, or just, habitat management, prairies, that kind of stumbled upon these systems, started coming to the training, and then basically requiring the landowners to start doing it. Now, Illinois still doesn't have a very strong NRCS program to adopt it. We are kind of doing this largely through EPA funding in order to do that work and slowly convincing NRCS to do it. Now in Wisconsin, it was kind of the opposite. Wisconsin is very unique culturally, where we do have conservation kind of embedded to our core. We are also the dairyland state with probably one of the biggest failing commodity farming systems in the US. We lost 60-70% of our dairies just in the past number of years. Like, people are desperately looking for alternatives. Coupled that with also a high percentage of absentee landowners that are learning about conservation, learning about alternative system. And we had some really radical with NRCS state leads for Wisconsin that were foresters, and really thinking about what does it mean to have a savanna? What are the alternatives to savanna? Shouldn't we be grazing savannas, which is just a huge conversation in NRCS. And then that starts to really lead about, well, what about converting cornfields? And then convincing dairy farmers to start grazing their cows instead of keeping them in CAFOs. So that leads to good pasture management, which then shade becomes an issue. So then there you go. Silvopasture by addition becomes a resolution. So Wisconsin was very kind of top-down approach in that success. And all along, Savanna Institute was just kind of running full speed with just getting the people that were doing it well and doing it right and bringing those people to that site. Finding those good apples and showing it off as best as you can, giving those farmers that platform to show their innovations and why it's critical. We also had Mark Shepard in this community that wrote regenerative agriculture text basically on these systems. So culturally, it was already there. Now, alternatively, in the Northeast, I think largely that was driven by landowners asking for it. They still struggle with the kind of state NRCS ability to release funding through NRCS for BMP implementation, a number of things, but that's quickly changing because the landowners are asking for it. So that chicken and the egg thing is definitely a real issue, and I think it really stems from the culture in the community. In Pennsylvania, the NRCS and the institutional culture, they didn't care at all about agroforestry or that system. It was either orcharding or farming. But the landowners were really asking for it and pushing it. And over the last 8 years, now it's institutionally recognized and now it's institutionally supported. So I don't know how that helps you all. I think the bottom-up approach is probably better, and especially if you already don't have people at the higher level that can release the funding and the resources to really kind of try to drive that landowner interest. Because the more landowners that ask for these practices to field staff, the more the field staff go up the chain to ask for it to be allowed in the state. So I think that was the route I was really going for when I was in Washington, and really trying to prioritize, because we didn't have that direct opportunity.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like, well, it should be mentioned that Bruce, you had a whole suite of really good questions in the chat. And I don't know if we're able to get to all of them, but maybe if not, we can copy and paste that into an email with Erik to dig into later. Carrie, am I missing? Because we could dig into those too. I'm not sure if there was any other questions from the group though.
I have a quick question. This is Rachel from Cloud Mountain Farm Center. Is there any data or research around agroforestry in relation to fish habitats? I'm just thinking especially about salmon in this area, or if that is something that needs to be done.
Yeah, that is a great question. There is a lot around, riparian forest buffers for sure. There's a lot around in the Pennsylvania. There's this organization called the Stroud Research Center, the Stroud Water Research Center, and they've done some pretty extensive literature review, meta-analysis on data around specifically just that issue. What is native leaf constituencies, chemical constituencies mean for macroinvertebrants, which translates into the trophic sphere of fish habitat. That's specifically for trout, and obviously on the East Coast. There's definitely a number of shading studies that came out of Washington State specifically for salmon habitat. There's a lot of interesting stuff out of Georgia around shading. And actually, there's a lot of stuff out of Pennsylvania that conflicts a lot of that shading data. Maybe it's a latitudinal thing, I don't know, but there's a lot of my work with the USDA was looking at research on that specific question, not necessarily on the fish habitat, but what are the attributes, the physical attributes of riparian buffers. And what I found was, for every published study on one idea, there's a published study that conflicts it. And a whole network of supporters on both sides. So basically what it told me is it's that fact that there is no facts in ecology, right? So I think it's all dependent on the context. So I think, to directly answer your question, I think a lot more research needs to be done in the Pacific Northwest on salmon habitat. I think it's really interesting to think about, native versus non-native species, the shading issue, the water temp issue. Fecal coliform is the big issue in that area, which I know doesn't necessarily impact salmon, but it does the fisheries or the shellfish fishery industry. So I think there's a lot there to unpack that would be really important, because the Pacific Northwest is so unique. With the species, with the soils, with the issues, all that.
And I will say, Rachel, we have grant funding that we're working on in North Puget Sound on these working buffers, if you will, these riparian forest buffers that are a combination of native, but also intercropped with or interplanted with high value crop type plants like elderberry or aronia or things like that as well. So it's early days, but we are planting out some of these systems and collecting data on them and starting to look at that.
Awesome, good to hear.
I missed a question in the chat from Brian. Do we want to do that one?
I like that one. I was just gonna.
Yeah, he asks, cut to 2035 and your goal of converting 1 million acres of corn to agroforestry. If you were to guess which type of intervention would be the most common, what would it be in your region?
Yeah, I love thinking about this. If I might get some paralysis through analysis, but through it, but I think again, every context is different. So a lot of that 1 million acreage really is going to be focused in the Corn Belt, so Illinois and Iowa. Down there, I think the establishment of riparian forest buffer along every water course is absolutely critical. There's not as much topography there, so stream bank degradation is not as much of an issue. So a riparian buffer is much more applicable to there as opposed to the part of Wisconsin that I'm in. Just the water quality mitigation concerns through the drainage canals and the tile drain systems. So saturated riparian buffers is a critical one that should take up a lot of acreage. Getting away from just grassed waterways, even though I do think grass waterways might be better if they're managed for hay for sequestering phosphorus and nitrogen. But I think the same could be done with willow and poplar in a coppice system. Alley cropping, I think, is going to take up the bulk majority of the landscape in displacing corn and soy. But for me, it is the intermediary to a perennial system. So depending on the scale of alley cropping you do, over a number of years, you're going to have shading issues and reduce yield in the actual alleys. So I think that lends itself really well into stopping the commodity production market for ethanol and CAFO feed and starting to get livestock back out on the environment, which requires the prairie to be replanted back to prairie and us to learn how to graze again and graze proper again. So silvopasture, I think, will be the dominant landscape structure in 2035 in Illinois. With every water course protected by a wildlife corridor, basically, maybe not even a managed buffer at that point. I mean, 2035 is not that far out. I would prefer to see every riparian buffer planted to a coppice system first. Get that phosphorus away from that stream as fast and as hard as you can. Put it into wood chips and put it back out in the land as fertilizer, whatever needs to happen. Just get it away from the water course. Stop drilling in phosphorus, and we don't have manure spreading in Illinois because all that manure is basically out on the Chesapeake Bay. So we're still importing the bulk of our phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen in our cornfields. And a lot of that can be just developed through coppice systems along the water courses in Illinois. Wisconsin's very different. I think we need to just jump right into grazing systems. We are in all of our erosion studies and kind of culture at the NRCS and USDA level came from erosional issues in the driftless region of Wisconsin. So I think getting away from confined animal operations, get feed production off the landscape and get it back into perennial, so silvopasture right away. So I see this landscape, it already is, it's happening with haste since dairies are struggling to begin with, that we're now moving into cow-calf pair operations and custom grazing systems and things like that. So really moving into good silvopasture systems is super easy. But like I said earlier, riparian forest buffers will not be a bulk majority of this particular context. So I hope that really just demonstrates like kind of the diversity of what that system is going to look like depending on the area. And I think Washington's got a really unique challenge there. There's not a lot of cropping ground. There's good valleys of it somewhere, but not to the same scale as say like Willamette or even out here, obviously. Grazing is already a big part of the Pacific Northwest, but fecal coliform is the #1 issue or #1 natural resource concern in water quality. So, what does that look like in a system? And what are the techniques of silvopasture that does and allow for good, fecal coliform comes from surface erosion, almost primarily from sedimentation. So making sure that there's systems in place, you know, good forage cover, good maintaining good stubble height and good rotational grazing, but also how does a silvopasture system, whether it's kind of like an alley crop system or on contour or as a buffer or in the confined, the concentrated bypass flow areas where you could mitigate some of that phosphorus out of the system or trap that fecal from running into the stream systems. I see that being a real bulk majority. And forest farming is also being probably the number one in your community. Production of understory medicinals and mushrooms. And I mean, one thing I talk a lot about to other state programs is how powerful the DNR wildcrafting program is in Washington State, where on like Olympic National Forest, you can apply for wildcrafting permits for the floral industry, for mushroom, and how much, and what I always found phenomenal living in Mason or working in Mason County was how that was dominated by the BIPOC community. How so much of Shelton is dominated by the Hispanic community, and it largely centered around that ability for that community to work within the floral industry, like Hiawatha and different byproducts of the timber industry, but in the understory management. And Jim Freed was an extension and DNR specialist in that area. That was just an absolute incredible resource. I don't know if you guys are still connecting with him with this group at all, but he would be someone to bring in to talk about, because he connected a lot with the tribes. He did a lot with the managing those permits and understanding how to make those permits sustainable over time. He taught me an incredible amount in regards to that.
Yeah, unfortunately, Jim Freed is he finally decided to retire, like actually retire. He retired and then he kind of hung around and helped, and he actually helped me with something this summer, but for the most part, he's actually enjoying his retirement now, which it's good for him. Yeah,
he was probably one of my biggest mentors. He's just such a phenomenal.
He's a great guy, and yeah, phenomenal resource.
Yeah.
We have about 4 minutes left. Does anyone have any other questions for Erik?
So I would say I apologize for talking so much. I was really hoping for more dialogue, and there's so much that I still need to learn from you all. I can always be reached. You have my email, Erik with a K at savannainstitute.org. Feel free to reach out anytime. If you're in the Wisconsin area, we'd love to show you around. If you're passing through Illinois for whatever reason, you would do that. No offense to any Illinois residents on this call. But if you are, there's some really cool sites that we got. Actually, some of our oldest sites are down in Illinois. University of Illinois has some really cool projects happening. If you're back east, I can connect you with a ton of folk back there that are just evolving these systems like so rapidly. It's just absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, I really hope to be able to dialogue with all of you at some point.
And I will say, there were some great questions about carbon sequestration potentials and carbon markets and things like that, which could be a wonderful conversation that we're probably not going to get to in the next 3 minutes. But that is actually a subject we will be tackling for an entire meeting in the coming months. So yeah, keep that in mind as well.
Yeah,
and thank
Bruce,
you so much.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I was just saying, Bruce, I'll maybe set up an email where you can send your questions over to Erik, and he can kind of
Yes.
Yeah, happy to do that. I was trying to read through it, but it's hard to listen and read. I'm not good at that.
Sure.
Well, Erik, thank you so much. This was awesome. I learned a ton, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us and our group today. And yeah, and thank you everyone else as well. And we will be sending out messages and things for future meetings and all of that. So we will be in touch.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for listening to me ramble for an hour and a half.
It was high quality rambling. It was really good. Thanks, Erik.
Good.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
You well.
Hey.